Hello everybody, it's Claire here from Sewn by Claire, and this is the latest skill builder video that we're going to do. And we're going to start with something really simple, and a lot of you will already be used to sewing just a straight seam. But again, for those that are beginners, because we're starting off at that beginner stage, and then we're going to be moving through to the more technical aspects of sewing, then we're going to just create our first sample, and it is going to be an unfinished seam. So an unfinished seam is basically a single row of stitching that joins two pieces of fabric together. So think of a seam on the side of a dress, or down the trousers, or just anywhere really on your sewing project, so around cushions, that type of thing. And what I want to do is, I know that this one is going to seem quite uninteresting to some people, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to be a bit of a benchmark for doing some of the other seam finishes, so you can actually feel the difference between an unfinished seam and some of the seam finishes that we want to be using, and also see some of the characteristics of it. So what I want you to do is to load a contrast colour thread into your machine, and I've actually loaded black into mine, and also have a matching bobbin thread as well for these projects. Okay, so I've got black in my top thread, and I've got black in my bobbin thread as well. This is a top loader bobbin. Yours might be a machine where you have to take this bit off here and get into the side here. Make the noise together. So the two pieces of thread going through the fabric and then intertwining is what actually makes your stitch and makes it join those two pieces of fabric together in a robust fashion. There are some elements regarding tension and regarding different stitches, but I'm going to do that in a different video. For now, this one is just basically how to sew a straight seam, as I've done in this sample here. So what I want you to do is, if you've not already prepared your pieces of sample fabric, I suggest you go back now and just put together a little pile. I've got a little pile here, so that each time we come to one of these, we can just take two off the pile and we're ready to go. So what I want you to do is take two pieces of fabric, and I want you to put them right sides together. Now, on some fabrics you can tell the right side, on some fabrics you can't. But for doing a general, so if you're doing that, two ways to mark the right side of your fabric. Oh, let me just get a couple of pins. I don't want white because we've got white fabric. Is that when you're cutting it out and you take your pattern pieces off, you can actually mark the right side of your fabric by just putting a pin in away from where you're going to be sewing your seam is. And that will do for now. If you've got a Frixion pen, you could always put a little cross on it, but this is just if your fabric pieces are the same front and back, just so that we know. So we're going to be putting our right sides of our fabric together. So I'll do it so the pins are out the way for me. And I want you to line the two cut edges here up together so that they're absolutely stacked one on top of the other. It's not like this, okay, and then sewing, because that's going to distort what we're doing. I want you to make sure that both those edges are, as far as possible, as absolutely on top of each other as you can, okay? And then we're going to look at our sewing machine. So when we're using our sewing machine, and we're going to be offering our fabric up underneath the presser foot, which is this bit here, and the presser foot moves up and down with a little lever on the back. Hopefully you're familiar with that already. Then on here, this particular model of mine, and there should be some markings on yours depending on the make and model of your machine. There's some different distances here that are marked. So we've got 1/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch, and 5/8 of an inch. And then what you'll also notice at the back here as well is that we've got 1 centimetre, 1.5 centimetres and 2 centimetres marked on here as well. So these actually just give us that ability to measure where we are, same on this side in case you're a left-handed sewer. And these actually do help us line our fabric up so that we can get the same seam allowances. Now, a seam allowance on a dressmaking pattern is at 5/8 of an inch, or you can see from here that's also the same as within a smidge of 1.5 centimetres. And that's because when we sew at 1.5 centimetres, we've got room to do a seam finish onto our sewing seam, but also we have got the ability as well to alter that garment in the future. So if we put a little bit of weight on, we can always let it out, or if we're on our seam, or if we have lost some weight, then we can also take that in, or we need something a little bit tighter fitting. So what we're going to do with this one today is we're just going to line up the two edges, the two raw edges here that we've got actually absolutely lining on top of each other, and then we're going to sew down this seam here. So if we look at our piece of fabric just here, we've got two ways of pinning this. You might be familiar with placing your pins this way in the direction of where you're sewing. Again, not wrong with doing that. I would always sew towards the point of your pin rather than away from it, because if you sew away from it, so like that, this pin head can get stuck underneath your presser foot and make it difficult for you to manoeuvre. Whereas if you have your pin, as you may have learnt at school, to do it this way, then at least when you're sewing towards it, we can then move that pin out the way, and then you're going to be able to sew. I'm going to ask you though to consider a different way of doing it, and that is to actually pin your seams at a right angle to the seam that you're sewing, because with these you can get really quite close before you have to move that pin. And in some kinds of sewing, especially if we're matching a waist edge on both sides, then we want that to stay as precise as possible. So that's one way of pinning your seams, is to actually put your pins an inch, couple of inches apart, whatever you're comfortable with, and then we're going to just sew that down. If you've got young children and you're sewing with young children, I'd consider getting some of these binding clips. You can get these from most of the crafting places now, because they're really quite useful. And these take the place of pins. So instead of having the point that you have to then navigate, especially with little fingers, and especially with ourselves as well, it's not nice to get pricked by a pin, we can just use these in the same way, just make sure that's on right, to actually secure the seam that we're sewing. These are really good as well if you're using a vinyl or a leather, because once you puncture that kind of fabric with your needle, your sewing machine needle, you can't get rid of that puncture, whereas on a fabric, your fabric can recover. So whichever way suits best for you, either pin or to clip your seam, and then we're going to talk about how to line the fabric up under your machine. So what we're going to do now is line the edge of this fabric up with our chosen our chosen seam allowance here. So for dressmaking, I'm just going to do this as a 1.5. So for this sample, if you can do the same, just line it up at the 1.5 mark, which is the same as the 5/8 of an inch mark, and just put your fabric in place underneath the presser foot, and you want to be starting on your fabric. We don't start off the fabric and then sew onto it. We actually start on the fabric. And what we're going to do then is we are going to use our straight stitch, and we are going to hold on to our threads at the back here. Oh, they've got stuck inside there. Hold on to our threads, because that will stop us from getting what's called a nest at the bottom of our work. And then we're going to take a couple of steps forward, and then we're going to press the reverse button. It depends, but you might have a reverse button, or you might, if you've got a really old machine, you might have to put your needle down into your work and then spin your work round to reverse and then down and sew back over the stitches you've just done. But most of the more modern machines will have a reverse button somewhere. So I'm going to press and hold the reverse button while I do those 2 stitches back again. And that's enough just to secure your ends. And what that means is that when you're working with that fabric, the seam edges aren't going to pull apart. And then keeping your eye, so when you're sewing, let me get my pointer, always try and keep an eye on where the edge of the fabric is in relation to the seam allowance, but you're looking, the most important part is across from where your needle is, and that becomes more relevant when we're actually going around curves. So for now, we're going to just try and sew this seam. We're keeping these 2 edges here together and on the 1.5 centimetre mark. So we've already held on to our edges, our thread, so we don't need to do that again. And we're just going to keep going down here until we get close to the pin. So again, I can get quite close to the pin. Use the crank wheel if you need to, your hand crank, just to put your needle down into your work. So that just moves it up and down a little on the right hand side. And then when you get close, you can take the pin out, put it in your pin cushion so it doesn't get into the carpet or
cause problem for pets or husbands or children or whomever, or even yourself. And then we're just going to carry on sewing that seam going down. So my eye is always at this point here. The needle will go up and down in the same direction and at the same pace. I just want to keep my eye on this bit here. So coming up to a needle again, so we stop while we take our needles out, because the pulling of the needle, pulling of the pin as we take the pin out can sometimes distort that sewing. So always get used to stopping whilst you're taking your pins out. And again then we're going to carry on down to the bottom of the 1.5. Now hopefully yours is a little bit neater than mine. And again we're going to press the reverse button just for a couple of stitches and then just sew down to the end. When we've got to the end, we'll press our foot up, take our needle up, and then we should be able to pull our threads out comfortably. Mine have just caught slightly. If you find that your work doesn't want to pull out smoothly, make sure your needle's at the top. So use your hand crank on the right hand side and just make sure your needle is at the top. And there we're going to have our sewn line. The other thing I want you to get used to is snipping your thread straight away as soon as you finish sewing that line and putting the threads in the bin, because that will save you a lot of time at the end, but it also means that everything looks nice and neat and well presented as you go through. It just saves you a lot of time. So there we've got our black stitching on our machine. We can see that that's a nice smooth stitch front and back. Now that we know which is the right side of our fabrics, we can take those pins out that were just marking that for us. And we can see with that reverse stop and start, we might pull a little stitch for the first one, but it's not going to pull any further than that. And so what we want to do now is we want to take this to the ironing board, and we always press our work flat with the iron on the ironing board. So we always press the seam flat first, and then we're going to turn it over onto this way here. And then we're going to open up this seam here. You can open it up with your fingers first and just run your finger along it if you want to. That's called finger pressing. But then we're going to do that with the iron and press the seam open. So let me just move to the ironing board and I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so here we've got our piece of work, the seam that we've just sewn, our first sample on our ironing board. We're going to take the iron. I have got it on steam and I have got it on fairly hot. So choose the right setting for the fabric that you're working with. This is 100% cotton. And I'm ironing this at the moment, so I'm moving the iron around and just pressing it flat. You'll see here two terms. Ironing means moving your iron around whilst it's flat on your fabric. If you're told to press something, you lift your iron up, you press it, and then you lift it up again to move it. That is the correct term of pressing, so that you don't distort that fabric. When it's cool enough to handle, we're just going to open that up on the ironing board and open our seam up like that, just with our fingers. Sometimes it's trickier than others. And then we're going to just put our iron on the edge, and using the nose of the iron, we're just going to move it along that seam. When it's on top, I'm just going to give it a burst of steam just to help hold it in place. So you can see this fabric is a little bit bouncy. So I'm just going to turn it back over the other way, and I'm going to press that again this way as well, just to hold it nice and flat for us. There we go. And so that's how we sew a seam. That's how we start and finish. It's how we pin, and that's how we press our seam flat. Now you'll see with this seam here that when we've got our sewn edge, that you can pull threads off here, and over time, if you leave your seams unfinished, then you'll get little frayed edges on them. Hopefully you can see these threads here. So if you think about when this goes in the wash, it's just going to keep on unravelling further and further and closer to your stitches over the years. So the next thing that we're going to talk about now, well, this is an unfinished seam. So what we're going to do now is we are going to label this element up as being an unfinished . because that one's a reference point then now to how that's going to look in the future and to why we want to actually finish our seams up. So once you've got this one done now, you can add this into your portfolio if you want to. You can make any notes. You could attach it onto a piece of paper if you wanted to, or a piece of card, and put it in a binder. But also then we've got this all set up now, so that says unfinished seam on there. So that's your first sample already. So we're going to move on to the some more seam finishes and build up your repertoire of how you can neaten and finish your seams. Thank you for watching, everybody. Have a great day and happy stitching.